recycles what is chronicled by the sources, while the other, Walter Kagi's Heraclius, Emperor of Byzantium, covers the fighting, but is primarily concerned with the feats of one important participant. A great deal of time has been consumed in research for this book. A prophecy of my wife's, that it would take as long to write as the events took to unfold, has, I fear, come true. Serious work began in autumn 1990, when I started a year's sabbatical leave. I am topping and tailing the 11 chapters, none very skimpy, into which it is divided, nearly 27 years later and deep into defunctitude, also known as retirement from university teaching, dubbed the twilight of the scholar by the young graduate students who enliven my existence. It is, I must confess, even worse than that. For the original inception of the project dates back to the early 1980s and took the form of a skeleton chronology handed out to undergraduate takers of an optional course in 6th and 7th century Middle Eastern history at Oxford. So what faces the listener is the product of nearly 40 years' work at the coalface of knowledge. That, as well as convenience, explains the old-fashioned terminology, Monophysite and Nestorian, used for non-Chalcedonian confessions. Miaphysite and Church of the East are now preferred. There were, I am glad to say, some byproducts, learned papers delivered at conferences, cited in the bibliography, and a book, Witnesses to a World Crisis, which laid down the historiographical foundations. The structure which rises from those foundations has acquired considerable bulk, despite unrelenting efforts to keep footnotes short and to limit references to primary sources and a necessary minimum of secondary works. I hope that the bulk will not be too off-putting. I have benefited from scholarly company of all sorts over these 40 years, above all from my undergraduate pupils with whom I discussed the last great war of antiquity in tutorials from the 1980s to 2009. They have been replaced since 2009 by a small number of young scholars with whom I have been meeting weekly in term to read texts in Ethiopic, Arabic and Syriac. I am immensely grateful to Phil Booth, Marek Jankowiak, Ed Sikovich Coghill, a fine Arabist, whom I cannot help but call Professor, and Simon Ford, not merely for helping me to plug shameful gaps in linguistic competence, but also for innumerable discussions of historical issues. There are many, many other debts, to faculty and college colleagues, to the graduate students with whom I like to hobnob in these declining days, to participants in several conferences on Sasanian history and archaeology held since the 1990s, to the conference on the reign of the Emperor Heraclius, organised by Gerrit Reinink and Bernhard Stolter at Groningen in 2001, to the 7th century Syrian numismatic round table, which meets at intervals of 2 to 3 years, and to travelling companions on journeys to Iran, Tunisia, Armenia and Algeria over the last 2 decades, for the ideas and banter exchanged. Although it may be invidious to single them out, and there is always the danger that someone who should be mentioned may be omitted, let me thank in particular the following for their contributions of information and ideas. 1. On the Sasanians, Richard Payne, the late Ze'ev Rubin and Josef Wieserhofer. 2. On pre-Islamic Arabia, Michael MacDonald. 3. On numismatics, Tony Goodwin, Rika Giselin, Cecile Morrison and Susan Tyler Smith. 4. On archaeology, the late Judith Mackenzie, Jody Magnus, the late Boris Marshak, Eberhard Sauer, St. John Simpson and Alan Walmsley. And 5. On texts, Michael Jackson Bonner, Tim Greenwood, David Gyllenhaal, the late Cyril Mango, and Mary Whitby. Finally, there are 3 scholars to whom I owe a particularly large debt. Phil Booth, with whom I have analysed the text of John of Nikiu, and who has read and helped to improve several chapters. Marek Jankowiak, first leader of our Arabic reading group, with whom I have been wrestling over certain historical cruces since we first met 10 years ago, and Constantin Zuckerman, Marek's former supervisor, whom I regard as a peerless scholar of this period and a formidable antagonist when we disagree, as we do from time to time. In addition,